On the morning of April 18, 2011, 3 dump trucks rumbled through a narrow gravel road outside St. Helens in Columbia County, Oregon, carrying what looked like the most expensive mistake anyone had seen in years. Instead of rich black topsoil, fertilizer, or seed, every truck bed held nothing but broken hardwood pallets, chipped lumber, cracked fruit crates, and weathered fence boards collected from abandoned warehouses along the Columbia River. The truck stopped at an 83-acre farm that had not produced a profitable harvest in nearly 6 years. People leaned against pickup trucks across the county road to watch. Nobody said much at first. Then someone laughed. Not because the wood looked worthless. Because the woman paying for it looked determined. 38-year-old Sarah Whitmore climbed down from an aging 1994 Ford F-250 with faded white paint, carrying a worn notebook instead of giving orders. She thanked each driver, signed every receipt herself, and quietly asked them to spread the piles exactly where she had marked them weeks earlier. No one understood why. The farm already owed nearly $168,000 on an operating loan left behind after her husband, Daniel, died from a heart attack during the previous autumn harvest. Insurance covered almost nothing. Equipment payments remained. Property taxes were overdue. The bank had already mailed 2 warnings. Yet here she was, buying broken wood. If you had driven past that field that morning, you would have thought the same thing everyone else did. She was burning money. But farms have a way of hiding truths beneath the surface, and this land had been keeping one for decades. Let me tell you about Sarah Whitmore. She never planned to become a farmer. She had studied elementary education at Western Oregon University and spent 12 years teaching 4th grade in Rainier before marrying Daniel Whitmore, whose family had worked the same Columbia County ground since 1968. Daniel loved machinery almost as much as he loved soil. He believed a tractor should be repaired before it failed, a fence should be straight before cattle leaned against it, and a promise should be kept even when no one was watching. When Daniel died, neighbors expected Sarah to sell everything within the year. Most widows did. Nobody would have blamed her. 83 acres demanded more than determination. They demanded strength, money, experience, and thousands of decisions that never appeared in farm magazines. She possessed only one of those things: determination. Daniel had left behind something else as well. A machine. Parked inside an aging red barn sat a 1956 Farmall 300 row crop tractor, producing 36 drawbar horsepower from a 4-cylinder gasoline engine. Daniel's father had purchased it second-hand in 1963 for $2,150 after a neighboring dairy closed outside McMinnville. Every winter the engine oil was changed before Christmas whether the tractor had worked or not. Every grease fitting received attention every month. The original cast-iron front weights still hung exactly where they had been installed more than 50 years earlier. Daniel used to say machines remembered kindness. Sarah had laughed the first time she heard him say it. She never laughed again after watching that old Farmall start on the second crank the week after his funeral. The tractor became company. Not because it could replace a husband. Nothing could. But because every worn pedal, polished steering wheel, and faded lever carried fingerprints from people who had already spent their lives believing tomorrow's crop mattered. She refused to sell it. That decision confused nearly everyone. The offers came quickly. Collectors offered cash. Dealers promised newer equipment. One man even suggested the old tractor belonged in a museum instead of wasting away on a struggling farm. Sarah thanked each one, then closed the barn door. Spring arrived with unusually heavy rainfall across northwestern Oregon. Soil tests revealed another problem. Organic matter levels had fallen below 2% across much of the property after years of conventional tillage and repeated hay production. Moisture disappeared too quickly during summer. Fertilizer costs climbed every season. The ground looked healthy from the road. It wasn't. Sarah knew enough to understand she didn't know enough. So she started reading. Agricultural extension bulletins. University soil studies. Old conservation manuals from the 1970s. Late at night, after balancing bills she couldn't pay, she filled notebooks with sketches and calculations. One idea appeared again and again. Wood chips. Mulch. Carbon. Moisture retention. Healthy soil wasn't built by adding more chemicals. Sometimes it was rebuilt by feeding the ground itself. The plan sounded ridiculous. It also made sense. Broken pallets could become wood chips. Wood chips could become compost. Compost could rebuild exhausted soil. It would take years. Most people never waited years. Banks certainly didn't. Have you ever believed in something everyone else dismissed before you even finished explaining it? That feeling settled over Sarah every morning as surely as the fog drifting inland from the Columbia River. By early April, she had signed contracts with 3 demolition companies willing to sell damaged hardwood pallets at almost scrap value. After transportation costs, she spent $11,840, money many believed should have gone toward fertilizer or loan payments. Word spread through Columbia County faster than spring weeds. People talked inside diners, at the grain elevator, outside the feed store. Everyone had an opinion. Most of them weren't kind. The loudest belonged to Mark Ellison. At 39, Mark owned one of the county's fastest-growing agricultural supply businesses. He drove a brand-new diesel pickup, wore polished boots that rarely touched mud, and believed efficiency solved nearly everything. His company sold fertilizer blends, irrigation systems, and precision planting technology across Northwest Oregon. He genuinely thought he was helping. When he heard Sarah was buying broken wood instead of nutrients, he drove straight to the farm. He stood beside the first pile of pallets, looked across the field, smiled, and then laughed loudly enough that every neighbor gathered along the fence line turned toward him. Mark Ellison folded his arms across his clean work jacket, shook his head once, and let out another laugh that carried across the open field. Not a cruel, theatrical laugh. A confident one. The kind of laugh a man gives when he is certain the facts are on his side. "You've spent nearly $12,000 on broken pallets?" he asked, loud enough for everyone standing near the fence to hear. "Sarah, that's not farming. That's paying people to dump trash on your land." Several neighbors chuckled. One man slapped the side of his pickup. Another whispered, "She'll lose the farm before Christmas." Someone else added, "Poor Daniel would never have done this." Sarah looked at the crowd. Then at Mark. She didn't rush. She didn't defend herself. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, rested one hand on the faded hood of the Farmel 300, and answered so quietly the crowd stopped talking just to hear it. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I'm feeding something you can't see." The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat. Then another wave of laughter rolled across the field. Mark smiled politely, almost apologetically. "I hope you're right," he said. "Because numbers don't usually lie." Sarah nodded once. "Neither does healthy soil." There wasn't another word after that. She climbed back onto the old Farmel, eased the throttle forward, and the 4-cylinder engine settled into its familiar steady rhythm. Pop, pop, pop. The tractor crawled toward the first pile of broken lumber with a homemade loader Daniel had welded together years before. The crowd watched for another 15 minutes. Nothing exciting happened. No miracle. No dramatic speech. Just a single mother moving rotten-looking wood from one pile to another while spring clouds drifted overhead. Eventually, the neighbors climbed back into their trucks. One by one they drove away. Still laughing. Only Mark remained for another minute. Before leaving, he looked back once more and quietly said, "I truly hope I'm wrong." He meant it. He simply believed he wasn't. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked alone nearly every daylight hour. She rented a commercial chipper for 4 weekends, feeding pallet boards, fence rails, orchard bins, and hardwood crates through the machine until mountains of rough wood chips covered nearly 20 acres. The work was exhausting. Nails had to be removed. Painted lumber had to be discarded. Only untreated hardwood could be used safely. Every evening her gloves felt heavier than when the day had begun. Every night another page filled inside her notebook. Rainfall, temperature, moisture, depth of mulch. She measured everything. Because Daniel had once told her that guessing was expensive. Recording was cheap. Let me tell you about the land beneath those fields. Most people think soil is simply dirt. It isn't. Healthy soil is alive. A single teaspoon can contain billions of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and tiny insects that quietly break down organic matter into nutrients plants can actually use. When years of repeated tillage and heavy chemical dependence reduce that biological life, crops may still grow, but the soil slowly loses its ability to hold water, cycle nutrients, and recover from stress. Sarah wasn't trying to feed corn. She was trying to feed the living world underneath it. Very few people around her understood that difference. Summer arrived warmer than average. The wood chips looked terrible. From the county road, the fields resembled construction sites instead of farmland. Neighbors continued talking. Children riding bicycles called it the wood farm. Someone nailed an old piece of cardboard to a fence post with the words, "Timber Harvest." Sarah removed it before sunset. She never asked who had put it there. Money tightened. Painfully. Fuel prices climbed. Repair bills appeared without warning. A hydraulic hose burst on the loader. The farmhouse roof developed another leak during June storms. Twice she considered selling the farmel. Twice she walked into the barn. Twice she rested her hand against the warm cast-iron engine block after finishing another day's work. And twice she walked back out without calling anyone. The tractor wasn't just transportation anymore. It reminded her why quitting felt impossible. By August, the first visible changes began. Not dramatic. Not enough to silence critics. Just small things. Earthworms. Lots of them. The soil beneath the mulch stayed cool during 90-degree afternoons while neighboring fields baked hard enough to crack. Wild mushrooms appeared after light rain. Grass along the field edges stayed greener longer than expected. Sarah smiled every time she dug another inspection hole. The biology was returning. The neighbors noticed none of it. What they noticed was yield. And there wasn't one. She had intentionally planted only a modest cover crop instead of chasing a profitable harvest. To many farmers, it looked like surrender. To Sarah, it was an investment. Banks, unfortunately, prefer profits to patience. On September 12, 2011, a certified letter arrived from Columbia Community Agricultural Bank. Unless overdue payments totaling $24,860 were brought current within 60 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Sarah folded the letter carefully. She placed it inside Daniel's old ledger book. Then she walked outside and kept working. 3 days later, Mark Ellison returned. This time he didn't come to laugh. He came carrying paperwork. He found Sarah repairing a section of woven wire fence near the southern pasture. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up. He handed her a folder. Inside was a financing proposal. His company had partnered with lenders before. If Sarah agreed to purchase fertilizer, seed packages, herbicides, and precision irrigation equipment through his dealership, he believed they could refinance most of her operating debt. "It'll save the farm," he said. She read every page. Slowly. Carefully. Finally, she handed the folder back. "No." Mark blinked. "No. I appreciate the effort. But I'd be borrowing more money to fix a problem I don't think money created." He frowned. "What created it?" She pointed toward the field. "We forgot the ground has to eat too." Mark stared across the farm. He wanted to argue. Instead, he asked a question. "What if you're wrong?" Sarah smiled gently. "Then I'll lose honestly." That answer stayed with him far longer than he expected. Let me tell you about old tractors for a moment. People often compare horsepower as though bigger numbers automatically mean better machines. But horsepower measures how quickly work can be done. Torque measures how strongly a machine keeps pulling when conditions become difficult. Older tractors like the Farmel 300 produced modest horsepower by modern standards, yet their long-stroke engines generated smooth, dependable torque at low engine speeds. That meant they could keep pulling heavy loads without constant shifting or high revolutions. Modern equipment is faster and vastly more capable, but those older cast-iron engines earned legendary reputations because they were built to work patiently, hour after hour, with remarkably simple maintenance. Sometimes steady pulling accomplishes more than sudden speed. Autumn settled across Columbia County. Maple leaves turned brilliant gold. Morning fog returned. Sarah walked the mulched fields before sunrise almost every day. One October morning she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. She knelt, reached into the soil, and pulled out a handful of dark, crumbly earth unlike anything this farm had produced in years. Behind her, tires crunched slowly across the gravel driveway. When she turned around, the last person she expected had stepped out of his truck, carrying a shovel instead of a smile. Mark Ellison closed the truck door without saying a word. The morning fog hung low across the fields, turning the rows of young cover crops into faint green shadows. He carried an ordinary round-point shovel over one shoulder, his polished boots already stained with wet gravel before he reached Sarah. She looked at the shovel, then at him. "I figured talking wasn't getting me anywhere," Mark said. "So I thought I'd look for myself." Sarah smiled. "That's usually how farming works." Together they walked nearly 200 yards into the field where the thickest layer of chipped hardwood had rested for almost 6 months. Without another word, Sarah handed him the small soil spade she always carried. "Dig." Mark drove the shovel into the earth. The blade slipped in more easily than he expected. He dug another scoop. Then another. At 12 inches deep he stopped. The soil wasn't gray anymore. It wasn't compacted. It broke apart in soft, dark clumps that smelled rich, almost sweet, carrying the unmistakable scent of healthy forest ground after rain. He stared for several seconds. "This can't be the same field." "It is." He crouched lower. Earthworms twisted through the loose soil. Fine white fungal threads stretched between decomposing wood chips and fresh roots. Water still glistened beneath the surface despite nearly 2 weeks without meaningful rain. Mark looked across the fence toward a neighboring field. The difference was impossible to ignore. One side was dry enough to crack. The other still held moisture. For the first time since meeting Sarah, he had no immediate explanation. He simply kept looking. "Let me tell you about something farmers rarely talk about outside their own circles. Most people judge a field by what grows above the surface. Experienced farmers often judge it by what happens below it. Healthy roots don't just feed plants. They build partnerships with microscopic fungi that extend far beyond what the roots could ever reach alone. Those underground networks trade minerals, moisture, and nutrients in exchange for sugars produced by the plant. Scientists call many of these relationships mycorrhizal associations, but generations of farmers noticed their effects long before laboratories gave them a name. Healthy soil behaves less like dirt and more like a living community. Mark stood slowly. "I've sold fertilizer for 15 years, he admitted quietly. "I've never actually looked at soil this way." Sarah brushed loose earth from her gloves. "My husband used to say the crop is only borrowing the field. The soil has to stay after we're gone." Mark nodded. This time there was no laughter. Only curiosity. Word spread through Columbia County again. But the conversations sounded different. Some neighbors claimed Sarah had gotten lucky. Others insisted unusually mild weather explained everything. A few dismissed the dark soil as a temporary effect that would disappear within another season. Nobody admitted they might have judged too quickly. Not yet. Winter arrived early. Heavy Pacific storms rolled inland throughout December. Nearly 9 inches of rain fell across parts of Columbia County in less than 3 weeks. Creeks spilled over their banks. Drainage ditches overflowed. Several freshly tilled fields lost valuable topsoil as muddy water rushed toward the Columbia River. Sarah stood beneath the porch roof watching rain hammer the farm. She didn't celebrate. Storms hurt everyone, even neighbors who had laughed. When daylight finally returned after another long night of rain, she climbed onto the Farmall 300 and drove slowly across her property. The wood-covered fields looked battered, but they remained intact. Instead of rushing away, much of the rainfall had soaked downward into the organic layer she had spent months building. The mulch slowed runoff. The healthier soil absorbed what neighboring ground could not. She wrote one sentence inside her notebook. Water stayed. Soil stayed. Hope stayed. In February 2012, Columbia County's Agricultural Extension Office announced a voluntary soil conservation workshop. Attendance was usually modest. This year the room overflowed. Sarah sat quietly near the back. Mark entered several minutes later. He noticed her, walked directly toward her table, and, to the surprise of nearly everyone present, asked if the seat beside her was available. The room fell strangely quiet. People remembered the laughter from the previous spring. They remembered the jokes. They remembered the cardboard sign. Mark remembered them too. When the meeting opened for questions, he stood. "I owe someone an apology." Every head turned. "Last April, I laughed at Sarah Whitmore in front of half this county." No one spoke. "I thought experience meant I already knew the answer. Turns out experience only matters if you're still willing to learn." Then he looked directly toward Sarah. "I'm sorry." She smiled the same calm smile she had worn nearly a year earlier. "Accepted." Nothing dramatic followed. No applause. No speeches. Just two farmers, because by then everyone quietly considered Sarah one, shaking hands. Sometimes dignity arrives without making much noise. Spring returned. This time Sarah planted a commercial vegetable crop across much of the restored acreage. Processing pumpkins. Winter squash. Sweet corn. She reduced synthetic fertilizer applications by nearly 40% compared with county averages, relying instead on improved organic matter and carefully managed compost. Neighbors watched closely. Very closely. Have you ever known you were right while everyone around you insisted you were wrong? And have you ever discovered that proving your point wasn't nearly as satisfying as watching people begin asking honest questions instead? That's exactly where Sarah found herself. The first seedlings emerged stronger than anyone expected. Root systems reached deeper. Plants stayed greener during dry weeks. Irrigation pumps ran fewer hours because the soil held moisture longer. Operating costs quietly fell. The numbers started telling the same story the soil had been telling for months. Mark visited often now. Not to advise. To learn. He brought notebooks. Asked questions. Measured moisture. Collected soil samples with Sarah's permission. One afternoon he laughed again. But this laugh sounded completely different. "I've spent years selling products," he admitted. "You've been rebuilding a farm." Sarah looked across the growing fields. "No." She smiled. "I've been rebuilding the ground. The farm comes afterward." That sentence followed Mark home. Within weeks, he began introducing organic matter management workshops through his agricultural supply business. Some longtime customers were surprised. Others welcomed the change. Slowly, the man who had once mocked Sarah became one of the strongest voices encouraging healthier soil practices throughout the county. Then July arrived. The hottest July Columbia County had experienced in nearly a decade. Afternoon temperatures climbed above 97 degrees for 8 consecutive days. Fields across the region began showing signs of drought stress. Leaves curled. Pastures browned. Farmers worried. Sarah walked her fields every sunrise. The crops still looked remarkably healthy. Not perfect, but strong. The old farmel rested beside the barn after another morning of light cultivation, its faded red paint glowing beneath the early sun. Sarah rested one hand against the hood exactly as Daniel used to do. Across the road, several neighbors stood silently beside the fence, looking over her fields. No one laughed anymore. One of them finally climbed through the gate. Then another. By sunset, 5 neighboring farmers had gathered around Sarah with the same question. She answered every one of them. Patiently. Because what she said next would change far more than her own farm. The 5 neighboring farmers stood in a loose circle around Sarah as the evening sun settled behind the Coast Range. For nearly a year they had watched her every move from a distance. They had laughed. They had doubted. Now they carried notebooks instead of opinions. The oldest among them cleared his throat first. "If we wanted to start," he asked quietly, "where would we begin?" Sarah looked across the fields before answering. "Not with the crops." She bent down, scooped up a handful of dark soil, and let it slowly fall through her fingers. "Begin here." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the questions came one after another. How thick should the mulch be? How long before the wood chips broke down? Which kinds of lumber were safe? Would it work on clay soil? Would it work on sandy ground? Sarah answered every question exactly as she had learned the answers herself. Patiently. Honestly. Whenever she didn't know something, she simply admitted it. "I haven't tried that yet." Those words surprised people almost as much as her success. She never claimed to know everything. She only shared what the land had already taught her. By the end of August 2012, 2 neighboring farms had begun collecting discarded hardwood pallets from warehouses along the Columbia River. By October there were 4. The following spring there were 11. People who had once called the idea foolish were now asking demolition companies to save untreated lumber instead of hauling it to landfills. Without realizing it, an entire community had started copying the woman they had once pitied. Mark Ellison noticed it before anyone else. One afternoon he drove past 3 separate farms and counted piles of chipped hardwood stacked beside machine sheds. He smiled to himself. Then he laughed softly. Not because the idea seemed ridiculous. Because he remembered the day he had stood beside Sarah's field and laughed for exactly the opposite reason. He pulled into her driveway carrying a small cardboard box. "I found something," he said. Inside lay the weathered cardboard sign someone had nailed to her fence more than a year earlier. Timber Harvest. Mark had discovered it while helping clean an abandoned storage shed. "I thought you might want it." Sarah looked at the faded lettering. Then she surprised him. She laughed. A warm, genuine laugh. The first souvenir this farm ever earned. Instead of throwing it away, she hung the sign inside the old red barn above the Farmel 300. Not as a reminder of embarrassment. As a reminder that every worthwhile idea sounds foolish before it succeeds. 5 years passed. By the spring of 2017, Columbia County's Agricultural Extension Office was inviting Sarah to speak at soil health workshops across northwestern Oregon. She always refused payment. "If it helps another farm survive," she would say, "that's enough." Mark often introduced her at those meetings. He never hid his mistake. Instead, he began every presentation almost exactly the same way. "I laughed at this woman before I listened to her. Don't repeat my mistake." People respected him more for saying it, not less. His business changed as well. He still sold fertilizer and equipment, but he no longer believed every problem could be solved by purchasing another product. Instead, he spent as much time discussing soil biology, compost, and long-term stewardship as he did inventory. Customers noticed. Many stayed because they trusted someone willing to admit he had learned something new. Sarah's farm quietly became one of the most stable operations in the county. Not the biggest. Not the richest. Simply one of the healthiest. During dry summers, the fields held moisture longer. During wet winters, erosion remained minimal. Input costs gradually declined while soil organic matter continued climbing year after year. The land had finally begun paying back the patience invested in it. The old 1956 Farmel 300 never left the farm. Every February, before spring work began, Sarah changed the engine oil, checked every grease fitting, adjusted the ignition points, and polished the faded Farmel badge with the same soft cloth Daniel had once used. Visitors often asked why she hadn't replaced it with something newer. She always smiled. "It still finishes every job I ask it to do." Machines like that earned loyalty the hard way. Let me tell you about that tractor one last time. By 2021, it had been working American fields for 65 years. Its original cast-iron engine had never required a complete rebuild. The steering wheel had become smooth from 3 generations of hands. The seat springs still squeaked exactly the same way they had decades earlier. Children visiting the farm loved riding beside Sarah during slow passes through the vegetable fields. She told every one of them the same thing. "Take care of good tools, and they'll take care of people you haven't even met yet." Those words stayed with them. Time, however, keeps moving. In November 2033, after spending another peaceful afternoon walking the same field she had refused to abandon, Sarah Whitmore passed away quietly in her sleep at 60 years old. There were no headlines. No television crews. No grand memorial. She was buried beside Daniel beneath a line of old Douglas fir trees overlooking the western edge of the farm. Hundreds of neighbors attended, including every person who had once laughed. Mark stood among them holding his cap in both hands. When it was his turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief. "I thought she was wasting money." He looked across the fields stretching beyond the cemetery. What she was really doing was teaching the rest of us how to see. Sarah's daughter, Emily Whitmore, inherited the farm. She had grown up stacking wood chips, driving the old farmel at walking speed beside her mother, and recording rainfall inside the same weathered notebooks. She never considered selling. The farm continued exactly as Sarah had hoped. Children became the fourth generation to climb onto the faded red tractor. The cardboard sign still hung above it inside the barn. Nobody removed it. Visitors always asked why it was there. Emily would smile. That's where the story begins. Even today, if you drive certain back roads through Columbia County, you'll notice piles of chipped hardwood beside fields that once relied entirely on conventional methods. Many of the farmers using them have never met Sarah Whitmore. Some don't even know her name. But they are following tracks she left behind. Quietly. Just as she always worked. Some things aren't changed by the loudest voice in the field. They're changed by the patient hands willing to care for what everyone else overlooks. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly proved everyone wrong, or someone who cared for the land long before others understood why, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Those are the stories that keep this community alive, and I read every one. And if you'd like to hear about the elderly Iowa farmer who rescued a rusted 1948 John Deere from the bottom of a creek and used it to save an entire harvest after modern equipment failed, that story is waiting for us next.